So, welcome back to Third Age Reforged and to another battle replay, and today we have the reenactment of the Battle of the Five Armies that I've been promising for the past few replays, and it finally makes its appearance here on one of the many variants, it must be said, of these maps that include Dale and Erebor in some capacity. This is one we have seen before, as most maps in the game at this point are. The channel's been around long enough to the point where there's very few maps that we haven't seen, albeit I think this is actually one of the older examples of this sort of Dale/Erebor joint map dynamic that we've seen. We have the cityscape that is Dale over here, and of course the Dalians are very much over here. We have the Mirkwood elves making their way across as well. And then Erebor itself, it must be said that on the interior there is actually a fair amount of detail here, including the walkway over to the throne itself, though you can't actually use that as a choke point or anything. The map does pretty much end over here, and it is a very wide open space as well, so I don't know necessarily how much of the interior we are actually going to see, though we have Thorin and his company stood here, very much the highborns of Erebor as it stands. But yeah, other than that, it's actually, in terms of how it looks, it is perhaps one of the more striking examples of the Dale/Erebor map that we have seen in the game up to now, though functionally and mechanically it's maybe one of the more simplistic, but that may very well make for a tighter battle experience here anyway. So we'll go through the attacking armies first and foremost, as we often do, starting off with Tommy the Wise here, who's playing as one of the Orcs of the Misty Mountains armies. Mountaineer at Coast are here, and their quality will certainly be needed, given their slightly better all-round nature with their stronger armour and their better attacking values, considering that there are going to be plenty of dwarves and elves that they are going to need to go up against. It is worth saying as well, I think this is one that was inspired more so by the movie, just based on how things are set up here, but still should be an interesting one. It gives people more of a frame of reference as to what to expect. And the White-Orc Fearmongers here are based upon the design of the orcs that were in the Hobbit trilogy as well, as are the Mountaineer at Coast, so it makes sense to see them in high numbers, though this is a lot of Mountaineer at Coast and a fair few White-Orc Fearmongers as well, so this makes for a pretty damn strong Orcs of the Misty Mountains army here. So I imagine we're going to be seeing much the same sort of thing for the de facto defenders as well, so I think what we're going to be seeing here is an all-round high quality affair, or higher quality affair when it comes to the Misty Mountains anyway. Mountaineer at Coast and more Fearmongers, plenty of cave trolls as well. I mean, it's pretty scary when you see this many trolls coming towards you. It does offset the fact that the cave trolls, at least in terms of sustained combat, are the weakest unit of trolls that the game has to offer, or at least on a par with the mountain trolls that we seldom see from Mordor. But they will still struggle against some of the shock infantry units that the elves and the dwarves do have to offer, so it'll be interesting to see how they actually get on, even in spite of their extremely high numbers here. More Mountaineer at Coast, more Fearmongers. This is a lot of Fearmongers. I mean, in terms of the phalanx that this offers, especially against the dwarves because of the armour piercing, this is actually going to be really, really effective. And even against Mirkwood, actually, considering Mirkwood don't have a phalanx of their own, so this could very well prove to be one of the decisive forces on the field. Speaking of which, Black Orcs of the Mountains also offer a bit more quality when you compare them to the Mountaineer at Coast. They're obviously more of an aggressive infantry unit, given the fact that their weapon is a two-handed sword, but more effective against the elves because of the base damage and the melee defense and the like. Exactly the sort of unit which we have seen be very efficient in the past for the Misty Mountains actually, but it remains to be seen here. I mean, I'm going to be expecting some very high quality forces that the forces of elves and dwarves have at their disposal, given the kind of armies here, though it must be said they don't actually have any bodyguard tier units here, Tommy. He does have a unit of warg riders, which is where his general is. I don't know necessarily cavalry wise how this is going to pan out, but we shall see. Moving on to the second attacking army over here, we have her Tumihai. So some Mountaineer at Coast are here, more White-Orc Fearmongers, more Mountaineer at Coast. I imagine it's going to be more or less the same sort of thing here, with cave trolls also in attendance. Mountaineer at Coast, Fearmongers, cave trolls. There are some bodyguard tier units in this army though, with the very scary blackbacks. They are a little bit fragile though, so against the very best that the elves and the dwarves have to offer, they may still struggle a bit, but the overall damage they do, especially to the non-bodyguard units they're inevitably going to come into contact with, will be the sort of thing to do damage to elf and dwarf alike. More trolls, more Fearmongers here in huge numbers. You know, this is the most Fearmongers we've seen in a single composition, this. Warg Riders are here, a couple more units of the Black Uruks, and finally another bodyguard unit as well, actually, in the Bolg's Champion, so her Tumihai's force is a little bit more high tier than Tommy's, but in terms of overall median quality, this is far more than the Misty Mountains usually have to work with. They usually have to make do with some of their more numerous, cheaper units, but on this occasion, not so. Meanwhile, as for more attacking forces over here, we have T.S. Niehoff playing as the Witch Realm of Angmar. Angmar, it's maybe going to be a little bit less surprising if we see them bring some of their higher tier units. If it's left up to the players, very often they go for the mid-tier on upwards because of how durable the Angmarim tend to be. And the upgraded Witch Realm Pikemen are a good example of that. They don't have the armor piercing of the Fearmongers that we saw from the Misty Mountains, but the extra range of those pikes is still going to be very handy. Moving on, we have the Gundabad Guard, which are a very solid unit of spears as well, which interestingly were completely omitted from the Misty Mountains force. Most of their spears are of lower tier nature, whereas the Gundabad Guard obviously are very much a mid-tier unit, more defensive in nature, not the best at dealing damage, though if they are focusing on Dale they won't have to be quite so worried about that. Against elves and dwarves though, they will struggle a little bit more to deal damage, and even against high tier Dalian units they may still struggle as well. We have some Angmar Halberds, which are a more basic unit of halberdiers, actually probably the lowest tier attacking unit we've seen so far. Another Phalanx unit, we've already seen very good halberdiers in the Fearmongers. These are far more basic, but they will still get the job done if they get bogged down in a fight and they don't have a stronger Phalanx unit going up against them. We have the upgraded Guardians of Khan Doom, a more defensively minded unit than the Mountain Uruk host we've seen from the Misty Mountains. They won't do damage quite as well, but they will take a beating, certainly more so with their armour upgrade and the big shields that they carry as well. It can make them a very difficult unit to get rid of if you don't have plentiful armour piercing or just outright quality in your ranks. It makes Angmar a relatively simple faction to play when you have this kind of unit at the centre of things. We have some trolls over here, unlike the cave trolls. The Trolls of Gundabad and the Trolls of Angmar, which we can actually see just in behind as well, are much better in sustained combat. Obviously the armour they pack on definitely helps with that. They're also going to be able to deal damage more so. They're not going to be able to smash through lines quite so easily as Cave Trolls with their tighter formation can, but still very, very useful at doing that big damage very quickly that Trolls are known for. Gundabad Guard and more Witch Realm Pikemen. We of course have those Trolls of Angmar, more upgraded. Angmar Pikes, we have Angmar Halberds as well. The Angmar Marauders are the lower quality unit of line infantry. I would say they're the equivalent of the heavy goblin infantry, but we haven't actually seen any of those as yet, so they will struggle mightily on an individual basis against especially the elves, you'd have to say. The elves with very high base damage tend to make very quick work of lower end units such as this, but we'll see. And then just in behind we have Angmar Marauders, more Marauders of that ilk, and then we have some Blackwatch Legion as well. Considering they're going after the settlement where choke points are a little bit more likely, bulldozing through with Great Shield mass pushes are something which T.S. Niehoff may be able to engage in a little bit more easily as a result of that. And finally for the attackers we have Medexa, who has got some Angmar Marauders banked up over here with some more upgraded Guardians of Khan Doom, more Angmar Marauders, more Angmar Halberds, the Scourge Raiders, of course the Throwing Axes, which again will probably find themselves more at home in the tighter confines of the settlement of Dale itself. If they get caught out in the open field, then Elven Archers and the like could be a bit more of a problem. Angmar Halberds, some upgraded Guardians of Khan Doom, plenty more Marauders and Halberds and Scourge Raiders. Again, double Trolls, with the Trolls of Gundabad and Angmar. In fact, maybe quadruple Trolls? Kind of hard to tell when they're all intermingled like that. Which are on Pikemen, Gundabad Guard, more Pikes, more Guard, more Gundabad Guard, and finally a very strong bodyguard unit as well in the Witch Realm Hammer Guard. Big armor piercing damage, very useful against the higher tier Dalians and Dwarves, less so against the Elves, but even so their high tier nature means even against regular Elves they should be just fine, even despite their armor piercing focus. Now then, starting off within Dale itself, starting off with Seraphim, just from a cursory glance here you can tell that as a result of their defensive position they're going to have to make do with lower quality units. Lake Town Infantry, it's going to be important for them to choose the right target because they're not the highest in terms of base damage at range, and of course in melee they're going to find themselves outpaced by especially some of the bulkier Angmar units they're going to have to face down. But if they can target down stuff like the Pikemen and especially the Halberds actually, they can find themselves scoring a lot of value and then being a vital brick in the wall of the defence, which is going to have to be fairly steadfast against the kind of foes they face here. Some upgraded Dalian Spearmen, which makes for a good bulwark on the front line. They're not going to be the best at dealing damage against some of the heavier Angmar units again, but they will at least be a little bit more capable of holding the line than the lighter Lake Town units that we've seen. Though the Lake Town pikemen do offer that phalanx option as well, they will find themselves outperformed by the heavier Angmar pikes. But this is still going to be very important because Dale, of course, have got that defensive position. They can dictate the shape of the engagement a bit more, and pikes can be very, very important of taking full advantage of that. Further back in the settlement, we have yet more Lake Town pikemen. We have the Celdwin River Patrol. Javelin's going to be important as well. You're going to have to equalise in terms of quality somehow, and yes, I think there are Elven units on the way to render a little bit of assistance, but Javelins are still going to be very important. We have Dalian Spearmen, we have the Dalian Bowmen, so archers, of course, very well known and renowned as archers are the Dalians, but maybe a little bit more so as a defensive archer force, but they're going to need to be able to deal quite a bit of damage here if they are to survive this onslaught. Lake Town Infantry, more River Patrol. We have the mighty Dalian Royal Guard, who we have seen be very effective at range and in melee, and they're going to need to be here. I mean, to be fair, relatively few units individually among the Angmarim can actually go toe-to-toe with the Dalian Royal Guard, but they won't necessarily need to go toe-to-toe individually with them if the rest of the army falls apart around them. The Blackshot Dragon Slayers, of course, with their Wind Lances, armor-piercing arrows, again, choice of target going to be absolutely vital for Dale here. More Dalian Bowmen. We have a Ballista as well. Again, the shape of this settlement, I don't know whether the Ballista is going to be that easy to use, but artillery can be the great equaliser in all things. It can really start making a mockery of all of the armour that Angmar pack on when they get fried in a single shot from the flaming shot an artillery piece can provide. Lake Town pikemen, more River Patrol, more Lake Town infantry, and more Dalian Spearmen. Interestingly enough, I was just looking at the mini-map just then. Is there? Yes, indeed, there are some more Guardians of Khan Doom pikemen, and another unit of Witchhelm Hammerguard as well, sequestered away up here on the hill, though they have a little ways to travel, so they're a little bit further away, perhaps. Now then, we have one of the Mirkwood armies under the command of Diego Rio Ramos, who are heading towards the settlement to try and help ward off the Angmarim. The Elven King's Palace Guard with the armour upgrade represent the best all-round unit of infantry we've seen so far on the battlefield, and will see as well, because the dwarves don't really have anything quite so multifaceted, thanks to the anti-cavalry bonus this unit has, as well as the anti-armour that it also provides. Very effective against most of what Angmar have to offer. All of what Angmar have to offer, actually, outside of maybe the Hammer Guard. We have the Hiri Ek as well. Don't have the armour upgrade, but then they don't necessarily need it. This sort of elven quality going to be vital to help the Dalians withstand Angmar's assault, and they also add some more archers into the mix as well. A little bit more damage focused Mirkwood, which actually is probably going to be a little bit more important here. Often is against Angmar, because Angmar rarely contests the skirmish fight at all, so you can often pick and choose your targets a little bit more freely. More Hiri Ek, we have more Hiri Peng, we have the Hiri Auth in and amongst things as well. Very good unit of line infantry this, and they should be fairly efficient against the kind of units that Angmar are likely to provide. More Hiri Peng, more Hiri Ek. We have the heavy swordsman variant as well, certainly. The base damage is going to be very useful against an Orcish horde, though to be fair, Angmar among the Orc factions are probably best suited to withstand the kind of beating that heavy elven swordsmen can provide just because of their enhanced armour. But still, you would still back the elves to do a lot of damage, provided they're used at the right time and not isolated. Another unit of Hiri Lung, and more Hiri Auth. In a relatively simple army, this is a more heavy-duty Mirkwood army that is heading towards the Dalian settlement. Then we have a Mirkwood army in behind the units of dwarves for the time being, starting off with winged swordsmen Sindar of the Girdle. Very deadly unit of cavalry this. The Volks champions arguably a little better all round in terms of their abilities, but the Sindar of the Girdle will certainly fancy their chances against regular wargs, and also as long as they can avoid the White Uruks, they could be an excellent hammer and anvil unit here. Some more of the heavier units as well, by the looks of things, that Mirkwood are going to be dealing with here. Hiri Auth, Hiri Ek, and Hiri Lung representing the vast majority of this front line by the looks of things. In fact, pretty much all of it, yeah. Spears, swords, and sword and board infantry. And the one unit that's a little bit different in all of that are the Elders of the Elven King, the other Elven bodyguard that Mirkwood have. Obviously not as good in melee, though they are still pretty damn strong as heavy swordsmen. But obviously they do have that bow in hand, and Silverthorn arrows could be very useful for helping to break up the assault here. And there's actually less archers over here, which is probably a little bit unfortunate for Mirkwood considering the amount of phalanx units they're going to be facing off against here. They're going to have to maybe rely on the dwarves a little bit more for that, but the Misty Mountains will be very pleased that there's only a limited amount of Mirkwood archers over here. Speaking of which, the Warlord is going to be playing as Erebor, fighting on home turf along with the Dalians. Ironfoot spears with the armour upgrade. We have plenty of Ironfoots just in general, and most of the compositions here are relatively one note in terms of the units that they have, but it makes for an easier time explaining what the overall focus is going to have to be. Spears backed up by halberds and pikes, and the pikes are actually going to be the important ones here, I think, because they can outrange the White Uruk Fearmongers, which are by far the biggest problem for the defenders to have to deal with over here. So yeah, going to be very vital there. And then another line of Erebor Legionaries, kind of similar in terms of quality to the Hirialth in behind them, though a little bit less mobile, a little bit more heavily armoured, maybe a little bit... You know what kind of differences there are going to be between a Dwarven and Elven unit of this nature. The Dwarves are going to be a little bit more slow, a little bit more plodding, but maybe better at holding the line. The Elves are a little bit more agile, a little bit better at dealing damage, but a little bit more lightweight as well. Ironfoot crossbows, very important this unit. Like I said, the Elves don't actually have that much in the way of ranged presence over here, so the Ironfoot crossbows are going to have to be the main ones really to try and deal with the huge polearm presence that the Misty Mountains have. A couple of units of Ironfoot wargoats, well, and technically the Ironfoot hammerguard as well as the Ironfoot wargoat chariots. I mean, this is a pretty big amount of mounted, well, prowess that the dwarves have at their disposal here, and one unit of Bolg's champions is not going to be enough to deal with all this cavalry. So all things considered, yes, those phalanx units are going to be a problem, but it's still going to be a fairly tough slog, I think, for the attackers to make continuous progress, given the, especially the dwarven composition. I think with the elven support as well, it just ties things up quite nicely. And then finally, of course, we've already briefly mentioned them, but Thorin and his boys, the Highborns of Erebor, who will be making their appearance later on. No need to make a cut for this one though. Things are going to get underway pretty quickly, I would suggest, with these two armies so close. So without further ado, let's get this show on the road. So I don't think there's going to be really a need for a cut here. I imagine that this is going to get underway fairly quickly as the orcs advance towards the dwarven lines. And as I mentioned in the composition phases, it's going to be an interesting kind of mix, this, with the Mirkwood elves not really having a huge amount of range support. It's going to come down, I think, to a good amount of quality on the front line here from the dwarves and elves together, crashing against them a rather substantial force as well. And we shall also keep an eye on the minimap as well for the Dalians and Mirkwood defending the city outside of Erebor. This Mountain Uruk host move forwards. It's a pretty decent force this as well, as we mentioned in the composition phase for the orcs. Of course, the Mountain Uruk host, they are modelled after the orcs that were in the movie as well, so we will be seeing a little bit of continuity there, as well as with the White Uruk Fearmongers. So we do have kind of the same sort of thing that we saw in the movie, where the very bizarre choice of the elves to jump over the dwarven line, in some places anyway, not all of them. Indeed, I think they thought better of it this time around, and they're actually going to allow the dwarven line to take the initial hit from the orcs, and that makes a certain amount of sense. The dwarves are very good when it comes to trying to absorb a decent amount of pressure. Mountain Uruk Coast, while they may be strong, I would still back them against Ironfoot spears in all honesty, but they're not going to be able to roll over a force like the dwarves all that easily. But with the White Uruk Fearmongers, they should have the tools to be able to make something happen. Fearmongers on the flanks as well. Ironfoot crossbows starting to fire in. And indeed, already we're starting to see a bit of a chaotic time. Sindar of the Girdle dancing around with the Warg Riders, and the Wargs actually sent packing fairly quickly there as the chariots turn around. So if they can gain a bit of a cavalry advantage, that will be a pretty big deal, I think, for the defenders over here. Though the Sindar of the Girdle, that was maybe a little bit foolhardy to try and charge into advancing White Uruk Fearmongers. They may be strong, the Sindar, but they're not good enough to overcome that kind of pressure. We see here a lot of cave trolls moving forwards, trying to bust through the line, and they are doing so. I mean, numbers are an important thing, and they're going to have to try and stem this bleeding pretty quickly. In the next version of the game, of course, trolls are being made bigger as units go, so they'll be able to do this to an even greater extent. But for now, the line looking a little bit suspect as we have a look back over here the trolls were the ones to move forward first and foremost, and they have actually managed to catch up to the stragglers among the Mirkwood forces who are trying to make it back within the settlement quickly. It's a lot of trolls. It's the level of trolls that you would expect to see actually from the next patch of the game. I'm sure that we will have seen an example of that by now. But still, Angmar actually directly moving into the settlement fairly quickly. And while Mirkwood do have most of their units getting back into a defensive shape with Dale, some of them are getting a bit more isolated, and something like the Elven King's Palace Guard getting isolated is maybe a little bit of a concern for the defenders. It's the kind of high quality unit you want to have with the rest of them rather than being outnumbered and overwhelmed in the initial parts of the city. We will keep an eye on that. Meanwhile, making our way back over here, the mini-map actually paints a reasonable picture for the defenders, but when you actually look over here, this hole in the middle of their lines has turned into a little bit of a concern, especially with black back mountain berserkers getting in here as well. Erebor legionaries are strong, but they won't like facing off against the very best that the Misty Mountains have to offer. And also with black Uruks of the mountains, they are shaken. One of the better units that the Misty Mountains have for trying to go toe-to-toe with the elves, but isolated as they are, they will still struggle a bit more. The cave trolls are still alive, doing quite well. Hiri Lung, probably one of the better units for dealing with trolls, but again, those fearmongers, they're actually shaken. Shaken in several places here, the attackers, so while the situation looks pretty good for them in parts, it's a pretty delicate balance they have to strike, because as soon as they start losing vast swathes of their army to routing, the situation could get away from them pretty quickly. Elders of the Elven King using their Silverthorn arrows as well over here on this flank. The Erebor legionaries backing up the Ironfoot spears, shoring up this side of the line. Seem to have the Girdle moving in as well, trying to deal with the units that have managed to slip the net, and they have more or less recovered a line here, defenders. Although over on this flank, this pocket of Elven resistance is very likely to be overwhelmed. One of the Misty Mountains generals we just saw, I was going to say, he was all on his lonesome there. He has dealt with them. Black Uruks of the mountains doing quite well here. White Uruk fearmongers in behind enemy lines is still the small matter of some cavalry running around. The Bolg champions going to try and deal with what's left of the war goats, but this is a large amount of routing, and like I said, as soon as this starts, I don't know if the attackers are going to be able to sustain the level of pressure needed to really take the defending lines to task. Mountain Uruk host still fighting, but that's a lot of units that just left. Many of them as well decent in terms of quality. There's not a huge amount of low-end units or extreme low-end units that the Misty Mountains are having to deal with here. Well, there goes a general, probably the Elven one, considering the Palace Guard's position. Lake Town Infantry firing through the streets, advancing Angmar marauders, and yes, this is where the Palace Guard were, mobbed by orcs and trolls. That was always going to be the problem perhaps for Mirkwood, but Angmar moving forward in the manner that you would expect them to. Very, very aggressive as a faction goes, and trying to carry their momentum through the settlement. And considering how the battle's not going the best for the attackers in front of Erebor, they may very well need to win this battle fairly comprehensively, the attackers, and then maybe take up position within Dale to get ready to try and repel the dwarves that are over there. Lumberman hitting from the side. Dale, of course, not quite as high quality in terms of the units that they have brought today as their elven and dwarven allies. They do still have plenty of missiles, and in particular stuff like the Blackshot Dragon Slayers are going to be very, very useful. This is the kind of situation where the arrow fire from Dale is going to be very, very important, but it's kind of difficult to take into to truly quantify the amount of damage that they're actually doing. It will add up, but that is a lot of orcs that are pushing through the settlement, and the trolls, who have already been a real concern, will now be barrelling forwards as well. And Plenty of those Lake Town infantry units. Gundabad Guard managing to slip the net as well, get into the Lake Town infantry and try and interrupt them. Some of the Elven units that did make it back to assist the Dalian front line are going to be here as well, and that extra quality will be necessary. Lake Town units and stuff like River Patrol are not going to do so well under the attentions of Angmar if left to their own devices. Over here, meanwhile, yeah, you can see that pretty much crumbling, falling apart at the seams, it would appear. So on this occasion, we can see that Highborns of Erebor have come out of the settlement now. So Thorin can say that he did at least lend a hand, but outright victory achieved. And even over here, they've managed to turn their fortunes around. So a fairly comprehensive win this for the defenders. There's still a few stragglers that have managed to regroup themselves. Hertumahai going to throw them in, maybe try and delay the inevitable reinforcements that are going to start heading towards the settlement of Dale. With that, I would suggest the defenders are in the ascendancy, and they look pretty good going into the latter stages of this one, when it comes to actually potentially going on to win the battle overall. For spears. Routing units still. Managed to get in behind the lines, and that's weird because it was looking fairly dicey for a second there. The push from the trolls was the main thing that would have concerned the defenders, but quality and morale, both of those things, proving to be real difference makers here. Sindar the Girdle quickly routing the remaining White Uruk fearmongers as well. There we have it. So it's going to come down to the quality of the Angmar. There's also a small matter of these forces up here on the hilltop, which are on pikemen, hammer guard, not the sort of thing which is the easiest to dislodge. All units coming through, Scourge Raiders. Kind of a simplistic engagement this. There isn't another avenue of attack being used, so it's all in on this front line over here. Trolls still forcing their way forwards. The overall lower level of quality from Dale here could be a difference maker, considering, again, Angmar, not necessarily the best faction at dealing damage in this sort of situation, but their defensive abilities, heavy metal really is the best way to describe them, I think. Living battering rams indeed, especially with the trolls here on the front line. I mean, when you're asking stuff like Lake Town infantry to try and withstand blows raining down from more heavily armoured trolls, you may be in for a world of hurt. Plenty of these heavier units moving forward as well. Angmar halberds in and amongst things maybe less high quality, but still the numbers game is going to be important here also as the dwarves try to filter their way back. A narrow Angmar victory is fairly likely, but I think Erebor should be able to clean the settlement out anyway, given their margin of victory in front of the Lonely Mountain. Across come the Lake Town pikes. Angmar Marauders victory seems certain. It's the Ballista. I don't really know how well the Ballista is done. I don't know if it's had the best of shooting angles, to be fair. They have to go over their own men from this position, and the uphill incline maybe actually is helping the Angmar in here. A rare enough thing. It's a lot of routing though. We've already seen the dangers of routing on the other side of the battlefield from the Misty Mountains, and now seeing the same sort of thing from Dale, and that should give Angmar the momentum to really start pushing forwards. But if you have a look, starting to see the elves have managed to cross the battlefield pretty quickly, and they're going to start attacking the Angmar from behind, and the dwarves probably will be siphoned off to try and capture the hilltop. Peng. Units over here? No. That is a building that you can enter. But no units sequestered away there for Dale. That's a lot of routing, and yeah, how quickly this has gone south for the Bardings. Trolls still. Some units managing to return, but as we've seen, pretty much the modus operandi for Angmar being employed yet again, and once again we see why it is so successful most of the time. Pikemen moving forwards. Will they be able to also do the same to the Mirkwood reinforcements that are on the way? As long as if Angmar haven't taken damage during these phases. Eerie Pang getting into position as well, firing in. There's a few Hammer Guard in and amongst things. The pikemen represent a pretty good target for Elven archers as well. And over here, again, Angmar still have a decent amount left actually. I don't know if the elves might need a little bit of support from the dwarves if they are to go on to be victorious here. I'm not sure. Blackshot Dragon Slayers. There's a lot of pikes as well, which is of concern. If the pikes can get themselves situated as Angmar now attempts to dig in and be the defenders. Oof. Another attacking general shot down on the open field. So far, the elves actually, I think, sensing the fact that on their own they probably won't be able to defeat what's left of Angmar without some assistance from the dwarves, so they're setting up in a sort of cordon around the settlement, and Angmar may have to turn around and be the aggressors once again. The elves perhaps fancying their chances more if they are being more reactive than proactive, which is fair enough. I don't think Angmar will mind too much the scary blob that they now are. Meanwhile, what have we here? Some routing dwarves, but the main dwarven army continues to make its way over here, and they will be attempting to take the hilltop. Of course, Angmar, I don't believe they actually have any ranged units over here, so they're just going to be really reliant on the terrain to do most of the damage for them. Guardians of Khan Doom, a few units of them, including pikes. Again, line infantry with pikes, and then the added armour-piercing damage of the Hammer Guard. T.S. Niehoff couldn't really ask for any better units to try and repel a dwarven assault with, so in spite of how well the fight in front of the Lonely Mountain went for them, the defenders are by no means out of the woods yet. Will they have enough left in the tank to be victorious? We shall have to wait and see. Dalian Spearmen routing. The Bardings. Will Dale remain in ruins in this version of events? Different pacing to the battle than how it went in reality, of course. Or in the story, I guess I should say. Angmar, again, focusing their efforts. Hiriak, ready. The elves are going to need more than just one unit over here. I mean, they can allow Angmar out of the settlement, I suppose, but I don't really know how. If the elves let Angmar out of the settlement fully, they're going to have to face them in a more open environment. And I don't know if they have the numbers necessarily to do that, Winged Swordsman. But we'll see. Stuff like Elders of the Elven King still very much alive. Ironfoot crossbows are an important unit to still have, actually, when it comes to the dwarves' efforts to try and take the hilltop. With no ranged units of their own, it could force Angmar into being maybe a little bit less defensive on the hill than they would ideally want to be. As Angmar are being let out. Eerie Pang still with some ammunition. As much damage as they can possibly do from afar here is going to be necessary as they soften up the Angmarum. Misty Mountain's of course fully gone at this point. It is only Angmar left. Dale as well, falling by the wayside. Mirkwood, I mean, the army they had over helping the dwarves was slightly smaller anyway, and with the losses that they did incur facing off against the Misty. Sindar of the Girdle, good opportunity to try and pick off some stragglers here. And Scourge Raiders with the high base damage of axe throwers represent a good target if they have any ammunition left. I mean, they're fairly decent as a melee unit anyway. Just trying to whittle away at the numbers advantage that Angmar hold out here in the open field. Surprised they haven't routed actually. It's interesting, some of the Daily and Royal Guard actually dead out here on the open ground as well. Wonder how they got there. There's an elf banner carrier who I think is glitched. No anti-cavalry bonuses here for the Sindar the Girdle to contend with either, so these are pretty much free kills. Some of these units getting stuck on the rock, and as a result they will be pulled down off their mounts by even line infantry units in melee. Pikes now also screening the front. You don't want to be charging your cav into pikes. We saw earlier on Sindar with the Girdle attempting to charge into White Uruk Fearmongers, and it didn't go too well. Moving further up, so the elves are also going to follow the dwarves, so I think the play here, try and dislodge Angmar from the summit and then utilise the hill as a defensive position to try and deal with the main Angmaran force which is going to be chasing after them. And Angmar moving through the settlement. It is still a large Angmar army that Medexa has at his disposal down here. T.S. Nihov, the odd couple of units as well, but his job mainly is going to be trying to hold on to the summit of the settlement for as long as possible. Dancing around with the Sindar. Surely that's a good opportunity to charge into the line infantry now. The pikes separated from them. Throwing axes being used. In general, throwing axes should be really effective actually against most of what Mirkwood have with their lower focus on armour. Maybe only 3 of the Scourge Raiders remain. Having a look at the situation at the top of the hill. Wisely, Angmar have backed up further, using the terrain to cover them from what they have obviously identified as the crossbows being the main problem. If they go around the corner like this, I mean, is there a position where the crossbows can still hit them down here? Possibly. They'd have to arc the shots a little bit though, and that does, as we have learnt in the past, take away from the effectiveness of crossbows a fair amount, not completely, but the dwarves are going to have to make do with a bit of a bizarre situation. Plenty of Ironfoot pikes. Daily and Royal Guard actually still alive, so Dale not completely dead. Seraphim managing to salvage one of the strongest units Dale have. So that could prove to be a real difference maker going into the later stages. And crossbows already in position as well as a defensive effort. So Erebor going to try and take the top of the hill. Mirkwood going to act as the backstop as Angmar inevitably make their way towards them to lay siege once more. Angmar have already demolished one defensive position. Can they do it again? Scourge Raiders firing away. Sindar the Girdle killing off something. By the looks of things, the remaining Scourge Raiders, though a healthier unit, will be able to lay waste to the Sindar far more effectively with more throwing axes launched downrange. It is still a fairly intimidating force from Angmar, though not limitless. When you look up at the defensive positions the defenders are now in, it is fairly intimidating even for a force like Angmar, whose entire focus is around trying to overcome positions like this. Crossbows perhaps not able to get into a good enough position to fire. Ironfoot Spears leading the way. More of a defensive choice, but I suppose if there's a force which is similar to Angmar in the sense that they're going to move forward and try and overcome with their own survivability as much as killing potential, then the dwarves certainly fit the billing. I'd be really concerned about the Hammer Guard though if I were the dwarves. That's the kind of unit that you can really legislate for. It's always going to be a problem for you. The Guardians of Kharn continue to shuffle in place. Dwarves moving forward, and I think they do need to try and take the summit as quickly as they possibly can, and the spears engaging with the guardians. Further down, Erebor legionaries at the heart of things as well. Going to be very useful. They will be able to overcome, in terms of quality, a unit like the Guardians. Pikes are a bit of a weird one as well. The dwarves have pikes of their own. They're going to need to get the Ironfoot pikes to the front line. The Highborns represent a bodyguard tier unit as well, though a far more defensive one than the Hammer Guard that the attackers get to work with here. Although attack and defence has got very much dual meanings for both sides at this point. Elves of the Elven King thinking about launching a volley downrange, but in the end thinking better of it. The Elven front line fairly dense. Angmar still slowly making their way forwards. Sindar. Only 7 of them remain, but Angmar doing their best, I think, to ignore them at this stage. And instead simply content to roll forth. Actually, we do have an engagement on the front line, although the Scourge Raiders, unsurprisingly, immediately rout in the face of the prepared Elven line. So there we have it. Lots of missiles being launched downrange now. There's a lot of arrows. Crossbows as well. Silverthorn arrows going to make life a little bit more difficult for Angmar as well to get that momentum that they want. Probably one of the few times we'll actually see the Silverthorn arrows used in that regard, as is the intent, rather than just as a high damage archer unit. Slowing that momentum, making it difficult to build up a head of steam. Exactly the sort of thing you want to be doing against the Angmarim. Two units of Scourge Raiders though. I mean, this is a good enough response. It's the sort of thing which will do a lot of damage to the elves, and it will require a response from the defending archers. But that is a fair amount of damage. Over here. The Dwarven momentum, very much here. The Hammer Guard are on the front line. Says victory seems certain for Angmar. That armor-piercing damage that the Hammer Guard are offering, clearly adding a good amount to their chances of victory here. Some units getting brushed aside, and it's a good thing for them that Medieval 2 doesn't allow units to fall off cliffs, otherwise I'm sure the dwarves would be trying to do such things right now. The crossbows are going to be a real concern as well though, the elevation actually not helping the Angmar in there, because it's allowing some of the units to stick out, and the crossbows, I'm sure, will take immediate advantage of that. Further back, Guardians. Only half. Well, the pikes probably the first choice of target for the crossbows. Momentum-wise, the dwarves should be fine here. They have the numbers, they have the pikes as well. So yeah, I think that's going to be ultimately too much for the Angmarim. You can see now all of the ranged units as well emptying themselves down here. I mean, Angmar, they have a lot of numbers over here. The Scourge Raiders up on the hill side over there, inevitably doing a fair amount of damage as well, but Elves of the Elven King, once again, Angmar attempting to brute force the situation. It's looking reasonable at this point. They appear to be gaining the upper hand. They're going to need to do it here against the elves, and they're going to need to do it to the dwarves at the summit of the hill as well. Will Angmar be able to do that 3 times in the battle? The attackers having lost all the other engagements that this Angmar blob wasn't involved in, that would be probably the ultimate advertisement for the way that Angmar do their business, I suppose. Scourge Raiders moving backwards. There's still a lot of pole arms in here, a fair amount of them being the lowlier Angmar halberds, but Windbad Guard on the way forwards as well, still the Scourge Raiders. Sindar of the Girdle will be trying to charge into those units as best as they are able. Ironfoot crossbows turning around. Do they have ammunition? No, they're actually trying to get up the hill. They're exhausted. Another unit of crossbows in a good position there. Mirkwood fighting hard still. Angmar caught up on them, and I don't think, I mean, you can see here that some of these units were actually retreated, some of those ranged units, so perhaps the defenders were merely future-proofing. So I think it's the Ironfoot pikes the main reason that the defenders have actually been so successful here at the summit of the hill. They've managed to counteract the fewer amount of Angmar pikes there have been, and maybe have taken away a little bit of the effectiveness of the very scary Hammer Guard as well, in for the deal. Guardians. What have we here? They're in a good position here, the crossbows. Can pick and choose their targets. I expected the crossbows to be more of a factor in the early stages against the Misty Mountains, but as it turns out, it's actually going to be now. If the crossbows can lay down their effectiveness, then the defenders really ought to be able to go on to win this. There's a lot of damage they're going to be able to rack up here. Windbad Guard, Guardians of Khan Doom. Heavy units which are taking damage. Mirkwood still alive down here actually. Angmar largely trying to bypass the situation. They will ultimately fall, Mirkwood, but they're going to go down swinging, as is often the way. Further up the hill. Seems certain. It's a little bit more surprising, I think, with the Dwarven line sorting itself out. I mean, Ironfoot crossbows acting as the makeshift line infantry unit to give the pikes a little bit of extra cover. But the pikes should be the thing. I mean, the last troll has also fallen as well, so one of the main options Angmar would have had to try and disrupt the phalanx has now been dealt with. Still trying to just force march their way forwards. Highmorn's Erebor. Thorin and his company. Still alive, still very much at the heart of things. Guardians. Dalian Raw Guard as well. Another unit of Hammer Guard. I'm sure the dwarves are not too thrilled about having to face a second unit of them. Can Angmar sustain this kind of assault though? Ironfoot crossbows shaken. It's a little bit fractured, this defensive effort though, with these units over here not covering the whole section of the hillside. Angmar, I think, have done the right thing by trying to drive a wedge between the various defensive lines. And still, Witchram Scourge Raiders. Those throwing axes have been a real thorn in the side for the defenders. Further up the hill. Defeat a distinct possibility. to rely on crossbows. I mean, the Daily and Royal Guard should be pretty good. They don't have armour piercing, but the base damage on those long swords should be enough to give many of the Angmar units pause. Even the Hammer Guard, considering their bloodied nature, won't have things all their own way. The summit of the hill. The dwarves have been constantly in the ascendancy here and trying to take the hill away from T.S. Niehoff's units, but the narrow nature of it means it's been pretty slow going for the dwarves, and it has allowed the rest of the Angmar to really start piling the pressure on the rest of the hill. Well, there goes Thranduil. I was just about to go and check in on the elves, but it looks as though that is the end for them, and that will free up a few more halberds, a few more pikes, a few more heavy spears to also start making their way up the hill as well. Sindar of the Girdle and Elders of the Elven King still doing their thing. Let's see over here. Panzer forces evenly matched now, apparently, the dwarves. And surely the Hammer Guard aren't here in enough numbers to turn this battle around, but the dwarves technically are on the inside of this surround engagement, so yeah, and I think the attackers are going to have this. I think they're taking just a little bit too long to secure the hilltop, and I don't think they've got enough to deal with the Angmar advance, and this is maybe the clearest example, this battle, of what Angmar are all about. As we have seen, pure brutish strength has been how they've approached literally every engagement they've been in, except for the defence at the top of the hill, but even there, the more heavy armour nature of Angmar still played its role there. And there we have it. The Battle of the Five Armies, in this case, is going to end with an evil victory. And it all started so worryingly for the attacks as well, with how the Misty Mountains crumbled in front of the Lonely Mountain. Could the dwarves still go on to win? I don't know, that's a lot of units they have to deal with back there. It looks as though they are finally going through the Angmar over here at a rate of knots, but it may very well be too little too late. We shall see. Oh my god, still 27 of them, surrounded by pikes as they are. Yeah, I think it's going to be too big an ask for the remaining Erebor warriors. Daily Royal Guard getting forced up against the cliffside by halberds and the like. Very much going to be that. Well, that's, I guess, the last of Mirkwood, considering Dale technically still alive here. Or was that the dwarves? There's only 300 frames left, so what's going to be happening here? There's 21 Daily and Royal Guard. They're not going to die in that time period. It's very bizarre. So the Dalian General, that's what this was tied to? Well, Captain Bard fell there. That's a bit of a weird victory condition. I mean, it wouldn't have mattered anyway, I don't think. Like if this was like a classic, you know, just eliminate all of the other units from the field sort of thing, the Angmar still would have had enough to go on to win that, so it doesn't matter too much. But maybe it was tied into the generals. I mean, Thorin was still alive, I believe, but that wouldn't have lasted too much longer either. Yeah, weird. A battle of many different aspects there. Like I said, the defenders did very well in front of Erebor. It didn't go very well for them inside the city of Dale. Mixed here on the hillside, but again, it really was just that one Angmar blob that went around like a horde of locusts really across the field. and one by one won their engagements until the point where they took it out of the defender's reach. Let's see what did the damage though for the Dwarven army. Captain Thorin, Ironfoot Spears, one unit not doing quite so well, but the rest doing okay. And that's not too bad considering the level of quality that the Misty Mountains had early on. The Ironfoot Pikes doing very well, very big part of the action. Erebor Legionaries, maybe you'd want a little bit more from them given their quality. The Ironfoot Crossbow. Cavalry is always going to be one of those things that either does really well or is a little bit underwhelming for the price, and I have to say in particular the Chariots were not really a factor here. The Highborns did okay, those Erebor Legionaries did better, but yeah, clearly you can see here that the most significant units that Erebor had at their disposal were the Ironfoot Pikes, and it goes to show how important that kind of unit to anchor yourself in place is, especially for a faction with the kind of focuses that Erebor do. Crossbows as well, of course, but that's not too surprising. Crossbows always well known for their abilities here, but yeah, we saw what Angmar are all about more than anything in this battle. We have seen this map before, albeit not set up quite like this, where it's meant to be a full reenactment of the Battle of the Five Armies as it was in the movies. But yeah, it's another one of those interesting sort of examples really of the Erebor Dale kind of map. We saw one a few months ago at this point, which was a little bit more focused around Dale as a city rather than Erebor and then the hills outside. But you know, this one I think is one of the older examples actually of this. So yeah, it's interesting to see. You can kind of tell based on how the cityscape has been crafted. It's sort of an older style of how people used to make those. But yeah, interesting. More of an advertisement for Angmar, like I said, this battle than anything else, but it's neat to see a reenactment of the Battle of the Five Armies from the movie as well. But yes, as for what's coming up soon, I'm sure that most of these probably would have already been seen, but I do have actually quite a lot to work my way through on the new patch, as well as a little bit of an update for Silmarillion as well that has come out, which hopefully I can show off a couple of the battle replays from there as well. So some of those may have already come out, a few more of those will be to come as well, and obviously we're marching ever closer towards the general release of the next version of Reforged, and then I can start a whole raft of new stuff, like in particular faction overviews will be the first thing to make their reappearance there. Anything else that I can think of? Again, my trips away for work are going to be fairly consistent, I think, so that's going to be something that does get in the way ultimately, but hopefully I can work around it for the time being anyway. And yes, it's worth keeping an eye, as always, on the community tab or any sort of announcements that I may make with regards to any sort of upheaval that may happen, because that may impact the schedule in terms of when I release things, at least on a temporary basis, but I've recorded enough in advance at this point, and that shouldn't be too much of a problem. I think I've managed to future-proof a little bit there. But yeah, either way, not really too important, but big thank you to all of the players. I can't actually remember the player who gave me this battle replay at this point. That's very embarrassing. I think it was the Warlord. He was playing as Erebor. But yeah, big thank you to him. Big thank you to all of the players as well. Big thank you to who created and set up this scenario as well. I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you'll join me for whatever is next.